So, who are the great workers' cooperatives funding the Remain camp? That brave grassroots movement standing up for the little people and for workers' rights and empowerment. Firstly, there's Goldman Sachs, a multinational which somehow manages to stand out as being particularly bloodthirsty and rapacious, even in an industry as cutthroat as banking. Next up funding the Remains are the lovable rogues at JP Morgan, a bank that has had to pay out around $30 billion in fines between 2009 and 2014 alone. Completing our trio of dodgy megabanks funding the Remain campaign, we have Morgan Stanley, who just this year paid $2.6 billion to settle claims related to mortgage securities.
I wasn't surprised at all to discover where the Remain camp has got most of its money from, the big banks, and particularly in the case of one or two of the big banks, those banks that actually were very, very involved in the terrible economic situation we had just a few years ago.
The Greek case alone should be enough to remove any hint of doubt about the true nature of the EU. Greece has been utterly crushed. Its people, its government, its public sector, its referendum result, all crushed by the European Union. The most vicious austerity has been imposed, basic workers' rights like collective bargaining removed, public assets flogged off, and yet the bailout isn't for the Greek people, it's for the foreign banks who hold their debt.
Greece scars my view of Europe, and I don't make any secret of it.
When we see what's happened to Greece, when we see what's happened in Spain, in Portugal, and even in Ireland, we've seen that the European Union has been responsible for ending collective bargaining, for totally ignoring the democratic wishes of elected governments, and of imposing a form of rule which has not been asked for by the people of those countries.
Well, I'm pretty staggered that any socialist, anyone on the left, could look at what happened in Greece and still be in favour of sticking with the European Union.
Greeks have been treated absolutely appallingly. When you think that they've got now 25% unemployment, the equivalent in Britain would be 7.5 million people without jobs. That's in Greece now. We've seen 25% cut in living standards, so working class people have seen their living standards savagely cut. And they've had, they've put a brake on collective bargaining, so workers can't bargain for better wages because of austerity and the bailout deal. So, I think they've been treated absolutely appallingly.
And when there were riots on the streets and when there were protests at the effects of that austerity, and when the Greeks elected a left-wing government, Syriza, they really wanted to fight back and challenge the EU's imposed austerity. And then when that was put to them in a national referendum and they voted decisively against the bailout package, which have imposed even more crippling austerity, far from being brought to heel, the EU establishment, which was part of the Troika in the negotiations with the IMF and the European Central Bank, was very bullish and said, whatever you say in Greece, you're having this whether you like it or not. We couldn't care less about your referendum. We couldn't care less about democracy. You're not going to set a precedent. You're not going to blaze a path for every other group of people around the EU who want to challenge austerity. We're going to make an example of you.
And austerity, let's not forget, is legally enshrined in EU directives on the size of deficits government can run. What other treats for workers is the EU busying itself with? Well, privatising train services across Europe, for one thing.
What we're seeing is that the British experiment is now being rolled out, and we're seeing huge numbers of job losses in particularly the former socialist countries, in Romania, in Bulgaria. There have been tens of thousands of railway workers who've been put into the job market, made unemployed by the sharp contraction in their rail industries. It's quite a shocking scale of cutbacks that are going on, and this really isn't being understood.
In 2019, the fourth railway directive, which is an EU directive, will be coming in, and that makes it compulsory for private enterprise to be allowed to bid to run and own the railways.
The fourth rail package makes it actually the opposite of that. They've brought in regulations that say that you've got to separate wheel from steel, i.e. can only in the infrastructure, which is the tracks and signals, or you can own the train operating companies, but not both. So really what we're going to have is the British example, which is the poorest performing and most expensive per kilometre in the entire European Union being exported to other countries in Europe. You know, you would have thought that they would have tried to bring the most efficient system in, which is a nationalised system, but in fact they're doing the opposite. So they can open up markets which have previously been closed to private capital.
Things that's happening in France at the moment is there's a national rail strike taking place. That national rail strike has been sparked because the European Union has told SNCF that they have to make French rail workers who are employed by the national rail company, SNCF, more competitive in terms of their employment contracts with the private sector rail workers in France who are employed by a number of different private companies. There are many private railway companies in France. Perhaps 25% of France's rail freight is moved by private companies, not by SNCF. So it's a myth that France is a redoubt of 100% public ownership. What you have, in fact, is a very fierce competition, and the result of that competition is to drive down wages and to drive down hard-won workers' conditions amongst railway workers in France and in other European countries.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn said in the leadership election that he wants to bring the railways back into public ownership. Most opinion polls now show that there is a significant majority across the country that want to see that happen. So the choice really for the next Labour government is, do we stay in the European Union, or do we do what the British people want and bring the railways back into public ownership? I know what I'd like to see. I don't want to be spending £72 every day coming into London.
We've seen a similar story with postal services. EU directives were the unspoken story behind the privatisation of Royal Mail. The EU's current Postal Services Directive is explicitly and openly committed to privatising postal services across Europe. As in so many areas, the EU legislates to create a single market. The clue is very much in the name. Nationalised services have no place in this market.
We were told that we would lose 50,000 jobs nearly overnight if we didn't join, and the fisheries would lose out tremendously, and all these sectors that would be ruined economically if we didn't say yes. And obviously that didn't happen. Again, I think it's really important that people in this debate, the ordinary people in the street, need to feel confident. They must have the knowledge about the facts, because otherwise it's very easy to just be, blown away by all these, all the rhetorics.
They really lied. They really exaggerated as much as they could. They said we would lose 100,000 jobs. Nobody would invest in Norway. The interest rate would go to the skies. We would be isolated. Nobody would speak to us. I mean, they said all those kinds of things, which has proved false, all of them, because Norwegian economy has really gone to the top after 1994. Investments, interest rate is low. We have the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. So this was all false. And happily enough, they didn't reach the majority with those lies.
The common fisheries policy, the British public understand it's about conserving fish stocks. Nothing could be more wrong than that. The common fisheries policy is equal access to a common resource.
The CFP is basically supposedly equal access to everybody else's commodities with your partners within Europe. 70% of all the European quota is caught in our waters, of which only 14% is caught by UK fishermen.
Oh, the CFP has been a complete and utter disaster. I think you'd struggle to find anybody that would say the CFP has been good. It's caused a dramatic reduction in the fleet, and it has hurt areas, fishing areas and coastal communities all around the UK.
I mean, the changes, if I can think back to when I was a young boy, my dream was always to be a fisherman and become a fishing skipper. That was from I was 4 or 5 years old. That was the focus. My whole life has been about fishing. And I've seen this port of Peterhead turning from a huge, bustling port. It was just a hive of activity to pretty much, let's look at it now, quiet, and we're still fighting for our cause and we still produce good fish. but it's a shadow of its former self.
When I arrived here, there was in the region of 600 vessels fishing out of Peterhead. In between Aberdeen, Peterhead and Fraserburgh, we're in the region of 230 processors. If we fast forward to today, we are looking at roughly around about 70 dedicated whitefish vessels for Scotland and 60 processors in the whole of Scotland.
Well, the main change is from it being the biggest fishing port in the world, it's now almost on its knees. We've gone from when I started some 50 years ago to having in excess of 600 boats that were fishing the world. We're down to about half a dozen now fishing the inshore waters. So it's been devastating. There's been thousands of jobs lost and never will be replaced.
The rule of thumb used to be for every one man fishing at sea, there were 6 jobs on shore. I mean, you had the region of, say, upwards of 20,000 people going to sea. You know, so you fast forward to today, I don't know, there's maybe 1,500 fishermen, and the jobs on shore will become a micro-industry for no fault of our own.
Major changes. If you look at my home port of Looe, just behind us here, it's gone from 35 trawlers when I started fishing in Looe to now, I think there's 6 or 7.
But at least with Brexit, we will have a say in our own destiny. We have to rely on an unelected EU representative to fight our corner for us, and we don't believe they're doing a good enough job for us.
They're not concerned about the communities that we work and live in, and we're left to pick up the pieces. And there comes a point that you've had enough nonsense, and this is the point. We have a referendum, we have an option to tell the rest of the European Council of Ministers and all the rest of them, we've had enough, we're stepping back, we're still going to remain your best pals, but we will do our own thing.
The fishing community around the whole of Scotland and even the whole of the UK are all wanting out.
The policies have decimated our fishing industry, without a doubt, destroyed it. 20 years ago we had 37 trawlers here, we have 7 trawlers here now.
I see Iceland thriving, I see Norway thriving on fish that they have their own quotas.
Norway gets a fantastic deal because they have a seat at a table where the decisions are made. The UK has a 12th approximately, because roughly there's 12 nations that's interested in fishing.
I haven't met a fisherman yet who's wanting to stay in.
A Japanese newspaper come round the other week, and their view is that in London, in the bubble if you like, it's not really affected anybody since 2008, and people are more or less 50-50, maybe a little bit more remain. But they came here and they couldn't find anybody to do a balanced article who wanted to remain.
There are certain tests of a democracy. The United Kingdom passes them, the European Union does not. There are certain tests of a democracy. The United Kingdom passes them, the European Union does not. Do you know who makes legislation, initiates legislation and implements legislation? Do you know the members of the European Parliament? Do you know the members of the Council of Ministers who make the final decisions on European law? Do you know the members of the European Court of Justice? Are you able, if you wish to do so, to unseat these people and make them accountable to you? The answer is no. The European Commission are 28 people who is an elite, an unelected elite. They initiate laws and they implement laws. If you went out and asked any citizen, who are they? The answer would be, I don't know. Ask them who Lord Hill is, for example, and you get puzzlement. If you ask them, can you unseat the European Commission? Well, the answer is no, we can't. So when you apply the tests of democracy to the European Union, it fails not just a little, it fails spectacularly.
The European Parliament has no right to initiate or to repeal that legislation. It can tweak, it can rubber stamp, but effectively that's a fig leaf for democracy.
The way that power is distributed among the institutions of the European Union gives a great deal of power to the nominees of the member state governments. In some ways you might want to think about the European Commission as a sort of commitment technology for governments that want to escape accountability to their own citizens and are able then to point at this unelected body that wields power over so many of the European competencies.
They can discuss things, they vote on things, but nothing can ever be started. Legislation cannot start from the European Parliament. It's only the commissioners who have the power to introduce legislation and to change things. And of course, so many of the directives that go through and the regulations that we then are forced to take have got nowhere near the European Parliament.
The idea that the European Union is a happy, clappy haven for workers' rights is complete nonsense.
Well, it's certainly an argument I've heard over and over again, and it doesn't actually get any more compelling each time I actually hear it. The truth is the national minimum wage was a UK demand from the trade union movement. It was fought for and it was won and enshrined in the UK Parliament. The same as equal pay. That was fought for in the UK and through the UK Parliament. There are many bits of progressive legislation that stem from UK action.
The European Union has added to certain rights and legal laws, but those have all been put into our legislation. So if we were to leave the European Union, those would still be enshrined in British law, and it would take a completely separate piece of legislation to do anything about reducing those, and I don't believe that that will happen.
Now, given the strength of the feminist movement and the strength of Middle England, I doubt very much, say on maternity and paternity leave, whether any government of any persuasion would have the stupidity to try to change those laws.
We do not need an unelected bureaucracy to tell us, okay, you can have these rights, hang on. So they're taking the power to defend these rights away from us and saying, oh, we'll defend it. Well, hang on, what's this about? We can defend ourselves. And once you give away the power to defend yourself to someone else, you know they can stop defending you. And as I say again, look at Greece. Were they defended? No.
If you look at the Viking judgment, which came before the European Court of Justice, there was a Finnish passenger ferry company paying high Finnish level wages. It wanted to change its flag from Finland to Estonia so that it could employ Estonia workers at very much lower rates than Finnish workers and therefore improve its profitability. The Finnish workers decided to take collective action. They were backed by the International Maritime Union, who is opposed to flags of convenience.
The Viking and the Laval cases were interesting and in many ways very damaging to the interests of trade unions.
That court had to balance between the right of capital to move and the right of workers to take collective action to stop it moving. The European Court of Justice not only came down on the employers on the right of capital to move anywhere it wanted within the EU under treaty law, but it actually said that the right to collective action by workers is not an absolute right. So from a socialist and trade union point of view, I want out of that kind of organisation.
I think it's pretty obscene actually that judges sitting in a court in Europe can determine what trade unions in Britain can and can't do and what action is legitimate and what action isn't legitimate.
A lot of nonsense is spouted about immigration and about immigrants themselves, but it should go without saying that the pressures mass immigration can bring are nothing to do with the migrants as individuals. They are the fault of no one but the British and European authorities. That said, there are structural issues that need to be addressed, and it should be understood that free movement is, at its core, a neoliberal attack on labour, on bargaining power, and on wage rates.
I think trade unions need to be braver. Trade union leaders need to be braver about the issue of open borders. They've been far too silent about it. I think you start from the position of saying, look, anybody who's in your country, regardless of where they've come from, you defend them, you expect equal treatment for them. As a trade union official, I want them organised into trade unions, fighting for better pay and conditions for them. And you absolutely oppose attacks on immigrants on a personal level. You certainly oppose any kind of racism. But there's no contradiction between that and also saying, but look, we've got a policy of open borders, which is having an effect on our communities, which is putting pressure on public services, which is, if you read some of the evidence, leading to the undercutting of wages. And that is not to blame immigrants personally, that's simply to recognise that governments and EU commissioners have made decisions that have not been in the interests of working people, and also to recognise that, look, the mass free movement of labour can be as disruptive in some cases to local communities as the free movement of capital. We need to understand that. And trade union leaders, I think, have been too silent about that up until now.
I think Labour voters have gone over to UKIP because they feel as though we're not listening to their concerns, particularly on immigration. There are communities up and down the country where there's been significant change and additional pressure placed on public services. Not all pressure on public services is because of immigration, but it is a contributing factor, as well as wage compression and competition for jobs. The Labour Party really needs to look at this and re-engage with those voters who are concerned about these issues.
Well, I think free movement of labour is really about bringing wages down and reducing bargaining power. Because if you've got a reserve army of labour, of competition for jobs, it means that employers can pay less and make more profit. That's what it's really about.
There is no status quo in the EU. It is constantly expanding, grabbing new powers, growing more unbalanced, more unstable. It does not have democratic support, the Eurozone crisis cannot be resolved and looks set to get even worse. More countries are joining, and the migrant crisis has already had serious implications, like the effective suspension of the Schengen Agreement, a core pillar of the EU. It is not remotely safe. The truth is, no one knows what the EU will look like in 2 years' time, let alone 10 or 20.
We are being dragged down by the Eurozone. This is a stagnant area of world economy, Europe these days, and it'll go on being like that because the Eurozone crisis is not about to end. Eurozone collapse lurks all the time. You won't have to believe me, believe the former governor of the Bank of England. He's quite clear. The Eurozone crisis will continue. Eurozone collapse will happen unless there's a fiscal transfer union. You can only get a fiscal transfer union with a much greater integration and, in effect, a country called Europe.
I think the EU at the moment is a train heading very fast in a very dangerous direction. You've only to look at the politics of places like Hungary and Austria, soon France, to see that there's a rising fascist tide within Europe that's understandable in the context of a set of constraints that give us deflation, austerity, limits on democratic accountability and participation. And so the idea that by simply staying within the European Union, we're not going to be heading in a very dangerous direction rather quickly, I think is deeply misguided.
Leaving the European Union doesn't just mean getting back around £200 million a week to spend on our priorities. It means regaining the power to make our own laws, to elect those who govern us and to get rid of them if we don't like them, to nationalise our railways if we so choose, to bring our postal service back into public ownership. We regain the power to rebuild a fully nationalised NHS in public hands, to strike our own trade deals around the world with whoever we wish, and to say no to austerity. We regain the power to be an independent nation.
I've got faith in British workers to be able to defend themselves and advance their own working conditions outside of the European Union. One thing I find interesting is, you know, many people on the left who are arguing for a Remain vote on the grounds that they don't think that British workers at the moment are in a position to be able to defend themselves against the Tory government outside of the EU. And yet often these are the same people who would support any uprising or revolution or any example of workers across the world overthrowing undemocratic power. In a heartbeat they would support all of those instances. And yet for British workers they say no, we need to hold fire, we're not quite ready because we've got a nasty old Tory government who might take advantage of us. And I think really that shows a bit of contempt for British workers. I think British workers are more than capable of defending themselves. And in fact, if you look at most of the advances that have been made by working people in Britain over the years, those advances have come about through the UK Parliament as a result of trade union campaigns. So the national minimum wage, trade union recognition, health and safety at work, equal pay. I think the argument that we need to depend on the EU to give us workers' rights is completely overblown. We've shown in the past we're more than capable of defending ourselves, and we can do that in the future.